we're trying to suggest here is that the political thought of Orestes Brownson provides perhaps the best way to understand the current dilemma that we have. And it seems to me, and I can say this because this is not a cardinal, is that as the Orthodox Jew here, I can say that I think one of the reasons that he is not so well known is because he's such a serious Catholic. And Catholics have suffered so much discrimination in American history, he's been left out. But his writing is as important as Alexis de Tocqueville, which people both on the left and right like to cite. He actually predicts a lot of the dilemmas that we have today, he says will happen. So what does he know? Or what is Brownson doing? What does he understand that he's able to see where America will go with his understanding of the two constitutions? So I want to take a little bit of a different tack in talking about them because it's true, one constitution, the written constitution, is for Brownson the liberal constitution, both in ideas, liberal ideas, and also in liberal institutions. And I want to make a difference between the liberal ideas and institutions established by the Constitution and Brownson's understanding of the providential Constitution. So yes, he does support the written Constitution and the liberal ideas and institutions, but he understands also the dangers of those institutions standing on their own. Brownson understood that liberalism, Lockean liberalism, and the liberalism that's embraced by the founders, left to its own, would bring about the destruction of political order. So while he appreciates it, and he's not anti-liberal as Patrick Neen and his buddies are, there's still a recognition of the dangers. So, for example, liberal, let's say, concepts and institutions, including separation of powers. Separation of powers is very important in our Constitution and for the purposes of establishing liberty. Checks and balances, federalism. But his understanding of the founders' understanding of checks and balances, separation of powers, and federalism is very, very different than the framers themselves. So federalism is very, very important, for example, in understanding what Richard again talked about as territorial democracy. If federalism is not as it's taught in political science classes for a long time, that it's different types of sovereignty competing with one another. That's not what it is. Federalism recognizes the distinction between the states and the federal governments in powers and responsibilities, but nevertheless, what's often missed is that they have a common purpose. So if you just think of federalism as powers, and distinct sovereignty, that becomes very dangerous for Brownson because it sets people against one another and it doesn't provide any common grounds. It has to have a common end and purpose. And so for Brownson, that common ground is provided by the providential Constitution. From Brownson's perspective, we have to say every government is providential because every government is from God. Because if every government is providential, it also has a responsibility and purpose. So for Brownson, and what the American Constitution does, together written and unwritten, better than any other, is to recognize that government has a providential origin, comes from God, but it also has a providential purpose. And in that sense, Brownson's understanding, let's say, of the two kingdoms is not, they should be collapsed or completely separate. We'll get back to that in a few minutes, but that political order has an important role as a mediary between the human and the divine. It's an intermediary. It brings the human and divine realms not completely together, but it creates the space, and the purpose for that is to elevate the souls of the citizenry. And this is very important because it's not just, again, the government is providential in origin and purpose, but because we understand that providence recognizes man's fallen nature, whether it's original sin or the first sin or the id or libido gone crazy, whatever. Humans are humans. And humans have a bestial element. But humans also have a divine element. Whoever doesn't recognize it doesn't understand not only the nature of God's creation, but doesn't understand human nature. The purpose of government, then, is to elevate the souls of the citizen, recognizing that we need institutions that bring us together towards a higher purpose. Now, having said that, I want to talk a little bit more about his criticism of the written Constitution and what he thinks is necessary for America to succeed with the unwritten Constitution. And to do that, I think it might be important for me to talk about the different types of democracy that he understood was unfolding. And this is especially after the Civil War. It's becoming more apparent once the Civil War was over. And one of the best things he wrote was, it's actually an article aimed at Catholic youth. It's called The Democratic Principle. It's a brilliant piece. And in reflecting on the past and where America was headed, one of the things that Brownson does is to distinguish between what he calls humanitarian democracy, personal democracy, and then providential or territorial democracy. And he says, very interesting twist. He says even John Calhoun, who is one of his favorite writers, John Calhoun accepted personal democracy, individualistic liberal democracy, based on social contract theory. So even concurrent majorities doesn't overcome the problem that's inherent in liberal ideas, because what the liberals don't understand, given human nature, is that left to our own devices and our idea of liberty becomes liberty to do that which we want to do. That's what liberalism will become. But unlike Patrick Deneen of Renewal and some of the others, the problem isn't liberalism. The problem is democracy. And Patrick Deneen wants to defend democracy against liberalism, but liberalism is not the problem insofar it's the root of the problem. The root of the problem is human nature, and the root of the problem, therefore, is democracy that's a radical democracy. And this is coming from a person, Brownson defends democracy, but liberal democracy itself can't stand. And the reason it can't stand, because looking at the Civil War, he said, what is the Civil War? The Civil War is a battle of interests, and the North is going to win because they've got the power. And what's happened to Congress after the Civil War, and the executive branch as well, is that it's a battle of interests. It's a battle of liberal ideas, but liberal ideas reduced to the lowest common denominator, which is self-interest. So Congress is being taken over by people whose interests are self-aggrandizement and money or fame. So the personal democracy says dangerous, but more dangerous is humanitarian democracy. Because humanitarian democracy doesn't focus on us as individuals the way that personal democracy does, but humanitarian democracy looks at humans as abstractions, not as individuals, not as particular people. And so what's happening as he's witnessing this is that humanitarian democracy is establishing ideas and rhetoric that will lead to the growth of government, a socialist government, he's saying this in the 1870s already, that will seek to provide the solutions to all mankind, right? Because humans are not individuals, they're an idea. And we see injustice, that we're just going to impose an abstract solution on abstract human beings. And that's what he feels is really one of the great dangers now. But in both cases, which seem to be opposite, humanitarian versus personal democracy, one going back to the individual, separated from all other individuals, the other talking about increasing the power of government, they're both flip sides of the exact same coin. That is, it's egalitarianism gone crazy. So, Brownson himself is a great believer in democracy, in an Aristotelian or Platonic sense, that is, democracy well educated to its proper end. So he's not against democracy per se. What he argues is that for the democracy to succeed, that the concept of liberty and equality must be understood in its proper sense. And for that, you need not only the written constitution, but the providential constitution, where political order, again, is an intermediary between the human and the divine, elevating the souls of the citizenry. So how does that happen? And what I want to talk about now a little bit is our political culture, which we all know is fractured, dangerously fractured. So this affects every one of us in this room. With our own families, our neighborhoods, things seem to be collapsing in ways that he talks about. Why? So the family. Sometimes we think of speaking of the family in relation to the government as keeping the government out of family. But the real point for Brownson is that the family is essential for the well-being of the government. Strong families are where individuals learn justice, compassion, because justice requires a recognition of your own limitations and sharing with others, which people learn in the family. But the more important point there is that a family should not be understood in the sense of it's government against the family or the family against the government, but that it's a relationship where one requires the other in order to fulfill the proper role, not only of the family, but Republican government. Private property. He's a great defender of private property, but he's also a great critic of private property from his early writing years when he's still a transcendentalist and a hardcore Democrat to his last years. Why? Because private property should not be understood in a liberal sense alone, that it's mine. Now, it's not that work is bad and property is bad, quite to the contrary. They're important, but it's a trust from God. Whatever we have for Brownson is a trust from God. That doesn't mean government can take it, whether it's local, state, or federal. It's not so simple. But government and property must understand that the importance of property is not just its mine. For example, the great 1765 statement, no taxation without representation. That's just that it's my money, so you can't take it. No, if I participate in the making of law that results in taxation, then it's legitimate. But I have to participate in the making of it, which most of us don't do. Or it seems completely removed from us, as is government completely removed in so many ways. So for Brownson, again, family, property, these institutions of the private order must be maintained, not just for the self, but for the community and for the safety and health, well-being of the republic. Same thing with communities in location, in territory. If you ask somebody, where's my hometown? The answer is the place I no longer live. That's my hometown, right? There's that disconnect. Or people will move every 7 years or whatever it is, for what purpose? Economic advancement. And the IRS will give you a tax deduction for moving for a job, but they don't give you a tax deduction for staying in the same place for 7 years. Why wouldn't they do that if you want to promote healthy communities? Right? Well, because we don't think like that. For Brownson, again, location, place is essential for promoting the interrelationships, again, that Richard was talking about. And so if you don't understand it from this perspective, this providential perspective, which again, not just God created and the purpose and origin of government is providential, but they're in the institutions of life. It's providential. And if we it's not just taking God out of the Constitution or God out of the public order, it requires something from you. And for Brownson, that is essential. So the liberal Constitution, the liberal order, cannot sustain itself over time. It requires this different understanding that's not an abstract understanding, but rooted in family, property, community, etc. I want to talk about how that applies perhaps today to understanding constitutionalism. But one of the arguments is that the future of American constitutionalism depends on going back to the appropriate liberal ideas that informed from the founders through a significant portion of American history that's lost because of the new liberalism, the new progressivism, etc. So we've got to go back to the old liberalism. The problem with that, from Brownson's perspective, is that liberals who call for that don't ask how we got here. Well, it's not fair to say that because they do. They'll say, well, it was the Great Society that changed liberalism. And that's true. It was the New Deal that changed liberalism. It was taking away from state legislators the right to elect senators. And we can go on and on and on and on. So there are ways to see changes in our idea of liberalism to progressivism, but one has to ask why. Why has this happened? And Brownson, again, suggests that this will happen because you still have to address those institutions of society that make freedom and justice possible, as Brownson understands it. And having worked with some state legislators who believe in freedom and property, I'm often puzzled by their complete lack of understanding of the issue. The problem, again, isn't liberalism. They don't ask the question. The problem is, for Brownson, democracy. It's human nature. You can't throw out don't throw out the written Constitution. It's problematic. That's true. But it's precious. And it's part of the reason that America can be a republic, an important part, half the part at least of why it is. But democracy is the problem. So don't defend democracy unless you understand both the dangers and the possibilities and what political order requires to educate the democratic soul. Okay? So the third one is the happy marriage of the liberal and religious tradition. They're complementary, but it's not a happy marriage in the sense that, everything's going to be fine. Because the point is, for Brownson, is that yes, there's an unwritten and a written Constitution, and they're both essential to our well-being, but there's a tension. There's an important tension. Don't think that they're going to go together so well. Understand all the damage that liberalism can do and the damage even religion can do. But there's all kinds of different religious beliefs, and Brownson's very critical of some of them, right? And again, it's not this religion or that religion, it's the idea of the institutions of political order working towards its providential end by bringing people together. So I think Brownson is very important for pointing the way to understanding the future of constitutionalism in America today.